think killing God was a mistake. So
Why?
moving.
I had a vision. They knew what they were doing. Zootopia is a movie from 2016 about racism in the police. I have seen it now 2 times. It's not that interesting. It's a text that teaches white children about the dangers of white supremacy made by white folks. I'm not going to give a definitive value judgment on whether they succeeded, but I liked it fine. Like, the message got across, I think, although I'm not sure if Zootopia really had any lasting effects on American culture with its allegory on race. Disney did do one thing, though, with the movie. They made the fox hot. Why? Part 1, how to make a person. I think I liked Zootopia more the first time I saw it in 2016. Zootopia is a fable about anti-black racism where a white woman solves everything. I promise this is important, and just like the movie, we do need to begin centering Judy in order to understand why the fox is hot, maybe. I hope. Zootopia was originally pitched as an animal-based James Bond-esque spy thriller by Byron Howard. Along with screenwriters Jared Bush and Phil Johnston, and eventually co-director Rich Moore, the movie expanded upon the fur animation techniques developed by the team that made Bolt, and also made Disney $1 billion by sharing the message, racism isn't a systemic problem anymore, during the early months of Trump's first presidency. What concerns us in our quest of figuring out why they made the fox hot, though, is that, as many scholars of white studies and black radical thought would argue, Zootopia is a race allegory that is primarily concerned with whiteness. Zootopia follows new cop Judy Hopps as she creates an unsteady alliance with Y2K sleazebag / the Dare blueprint Nick Wilde on their adventure to find out why predators are going crazy and endangering prey. They go all around the city while Judy learns people, including herself, are racist at least some of the time. And when people in positions of power are racist, Alana folks, or African, Asian, Latino, and Native American people, are harmed. It's a little buddy cop movie where you get enemies to not enemies. Judy solves racism and everyone's happy at the end, specifically because of this one interpersonal relationship between Judy and Nick. Yay. The thing is, Zootopia has that race problem. The movie's central racial allegory is between the prey animals, who are supposed to symbolize whiteness, and the predator animals, who are supposed to symbolize the diaspora beyond whiteness, but really just end up being mostly closely tied to black racialized identity. The narrative positions Zootopia as a utopia that only works because predators have integrated into prey communities, and the whole city is now post-racial. The Dutch angle is a camera shot used to depict a character's descent into madness. Yes, I know it's a little bit more echoey in this room, but the vibes are right for the Dutch angle, so I'm using it. So basically, post-racism is just this sort of glossing over of historical inequity and white supremacy in order to claim racism no longer exists, as originally coined by Kent A. Ono in his larger work on Mad Men. Zootopia feeds into this fantasy through the dynamics created between Nick and Judy, and the way the film attempts to gloss over the differences in power and agency within the state of Zootopia. Anyway, hell, everything about this movie positions itself as post-racial, with Jason Bateman voicing Nick and race-blind casting when it comes to the other prey and predator animals. However, just because the text is post-racist doesn't mean it's anti-racist. As Lindsay M. Cramer notes in her paper on the subject, the film opens up with a young Judy acting in a school play about the predator-prey history, which is bad. It's bad. Back then, the world was divided into 2, vicious predators and meek prey. But over time we evolved and moved beyond our primitive, savage ways. Now predator and prey live in harmony, and every young mammal has multitudinous opportunities. Things were bad, but the animals worked it through, and now things are good. Fine. Except the central plot of the movie comes about when predators begin going savage. Savage is never used to describe the acts of any prey, and with the historical weight of the word savage primarily focused on non-white, uncolonized people who have yet to be encompassed by the hegemonic global empire, the beginning of Zootopia develops as a myth where peace was impossible, but then predators became more like prey socially and culturally, then Zootopia became possible, which the metaphor, if it's working, is working poorly. This play, this history which Hobbes shares with the audience, is not interrogated by the film. But even if we aren't interrogating the film's racial politics as intensely as I am currently, the story doesn't make sense as history. Okay, so we have these mammals, vicious predators and meek prey, very racialized language within the movie, but we have these predators and prey who evolve to act more like prey, and then and only then live in community. Forget about the food chain for a sec. We found ourselves in a politic of colonization for the purpose of civility. The prey became the dominant cultural force. Their position of herbivore developed as natural against the predator's unnatural carnivore diet. The prey use fear as a reason to make sure predators are civilized.
There was really, and how do I explain it?
And I cannot stress enough how much this movie is supposed to be a racial metaphor. Black people who do not center whiteness and white needs within their spirits are no natural biological danger to white folks. Race is not a natural thing. This is a bad metaphor. You cannot use naturalness, the predator-prey biological dynamics to try and explain race. That's not how it works. It's bad. But even within this racial cultural flattening that takes place within Zootopia, the prey still fear and hold enough animosity towards their colonized counterparts that Judy and the audience have plenty of bigotry to recognize and reflect upon throughout the film. We come to know Zootopia as not actually post-racial. In the subjugation of the predator, the now imaginary image the prey need to literally create in order to continue their colonizing efforts as being the other from which the civility of Zootopia is formed. The central thesis of Afro-Pessimism is as follows. In order for a group to exist, a non-group must be established and maintained. And as argued by founding theorist Frank B. Wilderson III, along with other scholars who find use within this theory, Africans are the non-group for the group that is human. Race is the process by which this dehumanization occurs. At the same time, race also humanizes. Wilderson's argument posits that whiteness as an identity creates the most culturally powerful capital H human. He says the reason why other racial groups like the indigenous nations of North America or those of the Asian diaspora are still human is because the violence whites enact onto those groups has a concrete material reason. The Chinese had spices and resources, now have cheap labor. The indigenous lived on land we wanted to claim and develop. Meanwhile, Wilderson argues Africans don't have anything which required violence. He argues we, colonial white folks, enslaved Africans en masse because they were already not human. They were the animal, the mass term. They offered nothing, and we do not meet them as people. The violence we, along with the white state, enact onto black bodies only exists to further establish our own personhood. To quote Wilderson directly, that there has been such an increase in media coverage and yet little decrease in murder reveals the ease in which anti-black violence can be ignored by white society. At the same time, this reveals that when one is black, one needn't do anything to be targeted, as blackness itself is criminalized. Blackness becomes non-human so whiteness can be human. Blackness becomes criminalized so whiteness can become civilized. The actual actions then matter less. Politics can be dismissed. All that matters is the aesthetics, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we believe. Now, there are plenty of critiques of Afro-Pessimism. One such comes from the activist, writer, just brilliant person, Angela Davis. You should know who she is. In her critique, Davis problematizes the centering of blackness when discussing racism.
I'm very careful about the implications in this category, anti-blackness, implications that somehow black people constitute the most important group subject to racism, and that now anti-blackness is used as a way to be deeply critical of people of color.
Black folks are not immune to perpetuating racism onto other racial groups, and so Davis worries an over-centering on anti-blackness can break racial solidarity. Protesting for Palestinian liberation and security should be able to matter without finding a way to center blackness as the driving force of racism in these people's dehumanizing. Even as we see in the film, there is more than predator and prey when we talk about species makeups. Although the narrative flattens it, different species face different experiences dependent on social connotations. Judy doesn't like being called cute. Within these critiques, within the acceptance of Afro-Pessimism as a centering politic, there is a natural conclusion of separatism and Afro-nationalism. A new state that creates a new non-human, a new identity becomes the point of non-community.
I'm with you 100%.
More criticism, Spivak argues the state does not have to be like that.
But I just don't think that the state has to be like that.
The state should change. We should change the state. We must believe in the possibility of a state which does not center the experience or privilege or lives of only some of its citizens. We must imagine and fight for a state beyond subjugation. We must imagine and fight for a state in which all can speak. Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak explores the possibility of the state not without struggle, but a state where one can be heard. Spivak questions, what if we prioritize the people instead of the state? What are the effects then? What if the predators of Zootopia had more power than a mayor, more community than maybe a coworker or two, more voices to be heard and considered beyond the politicized fear of the savage? If we refuse to listen, then how does the story change? How would the mythology of Zootopia, the city, shift if predators as they are were allowed to speak and be heard without conforming? Beyond that, how would it change if birds or fish or reptiles or any other non-mammal animal were offered voice? Tune in to Zootopia 2 to find out. There is without a doubt a racialized mythology at play in Zootopia, a mythology which may only be challenged in minute and specific ways. As Spivak observes, some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West, or the West as subject. So too is the most radical points in Zootopia, set up to conserve the subject of Zootopia. This is the one thing all characters agree upon at the end. Bellwether, the villain, initiates her conspiracy to further establish and conserve a cultural dominance of prey hegemony. Nick and Judy are both products of the police's attempt of growing its state-aligned ranks into a post-racial governance. Zootopia, the city-state, works best the more different populations are politically and ideologically aligned with each other, the more culturally hegemonic its citizens become. The state adapts to meet physical differences, especially in order to establish and maintain economy, which is excellent. I like this. I like how Nick takes a product designed for elephants and reforms it into something fit for his gerbil clients. But the state panics and pushes those who cannot neatly fit inside the social box of prey away outside the city. Nick is always perceived to be shifty by strangers, including Judy when they first meet. Animals who go savage are secretly contained and used to further establish prey as civilized to predator savagery. The population is already primed to fear the frankly docile predator community, and they are eager to act when offered the chance to reinstate the identity of prey as both dominant and most at risk. I mean, the movie ends with the savage predators becoming prey again, which is, yeah, I'm glad the Ottertons were able to reunite and everyone lived happily ever after, but I'm struggling to understand the justice and progress afforded to the predator class when ultimately nothing changes in Zootopia. It's all aesthetics.
Aesthetics are important to me.
I hate aesthetics. At best, your kid is entertained, which there's certainly value in that, and through Nick facing the specifically human experience of racism over and over again, we, on some level, empathize with him and recognize both his humanity and the humanity of all who face prejudice. Hypothetically, this element of subversion is kind of successful. Despite all its false steps in the development of its world and politics, Zootopia certainly succeeds at making Nick a person with specifically human qualities, human problems, and human solutions. I would like Zootopia just fine if it wasn't attempting to be a racial metaphor, but it is. The central thesis of Zootopia, then, is that we should respect people who are different from us, because in reality, they are not different from us. Predators are like prey. Difference should be glossed over and often is expected to be. All throughout the movie. Judy does not want to be viewed as a rabbit, especially when she's at work, which is fine, but also really frustrating when later in the movie, she's in turn frustrated by DMV sloths depicting a strange double standard of interspecies bigotry. I just need you to understand that Zootopia's racial metaphor is strained at best and has a lot of cracks. It seems to make the political personal and in turn apolitical. The story only offers the majority of its characters the bare minimum, and in doing so, this critically acclaimed children's movie, which uses animals as racial metaphor, which it then attempts to begin some sort of really important post-colonial conversations through its mystery-centered plot, does a significantly worse job than 2014's Paddington, which is a totally different video for another time. We don't have time, because right now we gotta talk about this guy.
I'm not trying to get too philosophical, but I am a furry ally.
Within Zootopia, we meet no more than two foxes. Childhood bully Gideon, who has less than a dozen lines in the movie, and city hustler / primary character but not protagonist, Nick Wilde. Now, which character would you expect to have a more thorough and complete story arc through this almost 2-hour movie? Yeah, it's Gideon. The fox you probably totally forgot about. As I said in the beginning, this is Judy's story. Judy's experience with observing and enacting racial discrimination. Judy's arc, Judy's problem. The story of Zootopia is a story of racism through a specifically white lens, at best, the modern To Kill a Mockingbird type beat.
I've been appointed to defend Tom Robinson. Now that he's been charged, that's what I intend to do.
Judy's whole narrative arc, which does take place over the 2 hours, is focused on how to be a good cop. And Nick's is about why he should trust prey animals and the institutions they built to limit his agency, why the police are good, actually, why they are worth joining, and he has to be blackmailed into this work. Arguably, he doesn't even partake in a lot of the narrative transformation that he goes through until the last 30 or 40 minutes of the movie. Gideon, on the other hand, we know Gideon starts out as a bully who specifically acts out against prey animals. We can find reasoning, not justification, but reasoning for his bullying through the school play. He is disconnected from his history. He has very little species or predator community within his small rural town, and the first moments of the film feature prey animals, defining this alienation as not a problem because now predator and prey live in harmony. Foxes used to have a species connection, and now they're scattered and singular. As Don Bellwether comments later in the film, Zootopia's population matches the real world. Prey outnumber predators. Prey often keep community without predators. Prey get to define the predator, as savage, as non-prey, as non-human. At the start of Judy's story, her parents, Bonnie and Stu Hops, are both incredibly wary of foxes. Judy gets anti-racist brownie points for challenging them, saying Gideon was a jerk and foxes aren't all like him, but still accepts a bottle of fox spray from her parents as she heads to Zootopia. At this point, we are set to believe as an audience there has been no reconciliation between Gideon and the Hopses. Foxes are still dangerous, still a phantasm the Hops are able to use to collect all the anxieties they have towards Judy joining the police force. There are foxes in Zootopia. And do you know what they say about foxes? 3 days later, when Judy crashes out, she runs into Gideon again, who we find out is now a successful baker. He has a business venture with the Hops, which seems beneficial to both parties. He is well liked by Bonnie and Stu, not feared, and he apologizes to Judy for how he behaved in their childhood. At this point, 15 years after the initial bullying incident, we as an audience see, offering an explanation and taking on full accountability. And bam, Gideon's arc is fully complete. His identity and purpose fully articulated and actualized. He went from hurt bully to passionate baker to productive member of his community, making amends where required. Nick is not offered this same amount of consideration through the narrative, which would be fine, except it seems like he's kind of supposed to be a main character. maybe, like, it's like they want him to be a main character, but they didn't care enough. Nick, we know, was poor, raised by a single mother who faced a specific form of racialized violence just the same as Judy. He, however, faced a lot more prejudice from every direction, predator and prey, and seeing no other options, began hustling as a means of survival. He meets Hops, is blackmailed by her, takes her around the city, meeting people he knows, both friend and foe, comes to trust her a little, is hurt by her, forgives her, and reaches his own self-actualization by beginning a career as a cop, something he had zero interest in doing 3 days prior before meeting Judy, something he had no interest in before meeting Judy. Anything that happens to Nick after he meets Judy happens because he met Judy. We experience Nick's oppression through Judy, Nick's hurt through Judy, Nick's narrative successes through Judy. While Gideon is allowed to exist and grow beyond Judy, Nick is destroyed, completely out of the count, waiting under a bridge when Judy leaves him. Nick is a prop. His story only exists to serve the self-actualization of Judy as this anti-racist community figure, to the point where her actions help break down racial barriers at the ZPD. Nick is the first Fox to be on the force, and yet the movie doesn't highlight any of his perseverance like they did for Judy. Judy's story has already concluded. We're just tying up loose ends now. Now is where I start to worry about the possibilities of Nick and Judy's relationship and the plot to the upcoming sequel. Will we see Nick's own self-actualization? Will Judy continue using Nick as her primary means of anti-racist growth? To paraphrase from Kwame Anthony Appiah's New York Times newsletter, what happens when Judy is finished with her empathy for foxes and predators fieldwork? What happens when she's ready for a new project, a new species to advocate for? What will happen to their relationship? If her work is nearly finished, if Zootopia is truly a post-racial society, then where do Nick and Judy continue to build and hold relationship? Just right now, Judy needs Nick to ground her, tie her to different people around Zootopia, and Nick needs Judy to have self-purpose, be the cop, advocate for those left behind. No matter how you slice it, I'm worried the narrative constructs Nick as dependent on Judy, as an object waiting to be moved, to be used, to be beckoned. While Nick the Hustler was certainly challenged, not living a good life, he was in equal interpersonal relationships. He did things other than lay under a bridge. He had purpose and individuality. I'm not saying his life is worse at the end of the movie because he's a cop, just that by the end, he is fully reliant on his relationship with Judy to find purpose, find joy. At the end of the movie, we are asked to believe Judy is now a good cop, and Nick's a good sidekick to her. Nick is so ready for self-actualization. The canon has not offered that to him yet, though. Maybe it will one day, but until then, we'll imagine him primarily in his hustler garb, as someone who we'd like to remember as separate from Judy, as someone who can grow and change and be without centering Judy's gaze, Judy's story. So now we know Zootopia enacts the specifically human process of racialization onto its characters, opening up the possibility of interacting with them as human metaphors. We know Nick is extremely moldable within the narrative to match Judy's needs, meaning he is also moldable to meet our own needs and desires without totally destroying the character's qualities. So beyond being Judy's object of growth within her anti-racist journey, what else is Nick? Other than hot. I guess at this point we can conclude our attraction does come from these humanizing experiences alongside his kind of blank, malleable position as a character. We like Nick because we see him as a person, right? Right? His muzzle meets your lips in a gentle kiss, and you kiss back while continuing to cuddle him. Before today, it had been far too long since you last cuddled with a cute, fluffy animal. His muzzle snuggled you affectionately. Still got tooth marks on there, you comment.
Is that an art form? I don't know. I'm not an art critic. But I can sure as hell tell you that that's a crime.
Both animals are, and I'm sorry, I hate to do this to you, but we're going to have to talk about some furry adjacent stuff when talking about this movie. Definitely sexed. Judy has this eyeliner moment and very prominent hips, while Nick is very boxy and straight. Both are importantly bipedal and also wear clothes. Nearly all the animals in Zootopia wear clothes, and the ones who don't are classified as nudists. They are animals who keep mostly human attributes. They wear their clothes and ties, hold pens, drive cars, but they are also animals. I swear it's okay though, they made them sexy on purpose. Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner's absolutely incredible piece, Sex in Public, argues that we as humans reproduce our sexuality all the time through our actions. To quote, heteronormative forms of intimacy are supported, as we have argued, not only by overt referential discourse such as love plots and sentimentality, but materially in marriage and family law, in the architecture of the domestic, in the zoning work and politics. Other forms of performing sexuality in public include, say, paying for a meal, which is often reinstated by a waiter and their singular bill, wearing culturally gendered clothing, which emphasizes or de-emphasizes parts of the body, and back to specifically and historically heterosexual performance, pushing a stroller with a child in it. Yeah, we're getting close to the furry stuff, but just as someone who wears a sexy little outfit may not want to be treated as such by everyone all the time when they wear that outfit, the purpose of an act does not always equal the effect. Like, even though strolling around a baby would be considered performing sex in public, you'd be hard-pressed to find mothers who are actively hoping you consider their sexuality and performance of such that led to the birth of their baby they're just, trying to take on a walk. Just because people enact it doesn't mean they consciously mean to or want you to comment on it. And even though some may argue sexuality is completely different from gender, they are wrong. I heard it once in the forest. It's usually assumed I will be paying the bill when I go to restaurants with my friends that are women. Our hair, clothing, and bodies often emphasize our gendered differences, and unless one of us asks, we are often assumed to be on a date. When the contexts of intimate relationships are assumed based on our gender presentations, I am assumed to be paying, which, there's Venmo, so I usually just, we don't correct them. My waiters read heterosexual relationship, and I do not correct them. So thus, my friends and I perform a sort of sex in public. Laughing it off, we just find it quicker with less friction to split the bill later. We use gender markers to emphasize or at least assume sexuality. For a pretty similar reason, that's why we can still have racism without racists. Why we speak of structural change as being more substantial than individual. Why I can recognize the fox is hot without being personally attracted to him. Cultural language exists and will always be interpreted. Now, Disney does have a tendency to add gendered attributes to their animal characters, partly to humanize them for the sake of empathy. Women will voice the girl animals, men the boy animals. The girl animals have really big eyes, usually with lashes. Their gendered characteristics are cartoonishly emphasized for the sake of character design, and we especially see these characters through feminine animals. The feminine attributes are more explicitly sexed. Even with most of the male animals people agree are attractive, we see long flowing manes that move a lot like hair. We see attributes that at best we view as gender neutral when men keep them, but still traditionally feminine and traditionally human in their description. Luscious manes. The smirks, whatever. Just think of the horse from Spirit or any lion from The Lion King. Even when we take these industry standard factors into account, Judy is especially sexed, even when compared to the gendered language we learn throughout the film. In comparison to her mother, Judy still has massive eyes and really emphasized hips with a very small waist.
Aesthetics are important to me.
You're not a victim. Not at all.
To her opposite, Nick's sort of sexual performance doesn't come from the proportions of his body. Sure, he has a long torso, which translates into fan art, but he also has short legs. His clothing emphasizes his fox anatomy. However, his eyebrows, eyes, and body language always raise and lean and slouch in an often flirty, semi-sleazy sort of way. He's giving Timothy Chalamet, the cigarette-looking man you know isn't good, but is just so magnetic anyway. He doesn't care, except when it's discovered he might care more than anyone. He's confident in his craft. He knows what he deserves, and he's hot. He's hot because of it. He remains hot when that confidence suffers, when he must be reminded there's a reason to take pride in his skill, even when they fall short in competition. With his body language, and maybe because of the lack of any meaningful exploration of Nick as a three-dimensional character, we are able to use him as a projection for this type of nonchalant, sometimes slightly scruffy guy. Like, outside of the explicit performance of sexuality, you know characters like Nick, people who could play him in an adaptation. Jake Johnson and Lakeith Stanfield immediately come to mind for their work in New Girl and Atlanta, respectively. Side characters we grow to love and appreciate as their inner world grows and becomes more complex. Zootopia just doesn't have the time, but more importantly, the interest to develop Nick's complexity. But through rare moments, the narrative proves he has a rich history before meeting Judy. Fighting against the boundaries of the story, we know Nick must be a person with current dreams and aspirations beyond becoming Judy's sidekick over and over and over again. Despite the messiness that ensues in the failure of its racial allegory and sexing of its animal characters, Zootopia invites us to see Nick as a person. That's how its metaphor attempts to function, and so we do. And so many people who engage with this movie, from the academic critics to its fans, see this position of Nick's humanity as central. Nick cannot be inhuman. Nick is racialized in a historically black way. The critiques must follow these two central premises. This is why I spent like 3,000 words discussing race and critical theory, to reinstate my own premises to prove why Nick is hot. Nick is human. And Nick is sexed. The hot fox is something which exists, something which was designed and shared with the world. It is a human thing made by human people, so why do I feel weird saying the fox is hot? Nick chuckles, then turns to you and licks your cheek. He looks rather relaxed on your lap as you sit with him on the edge of your bed. You begin scratching his left ear. He moans, "Yeah, right there," tilting his head into your hand, and so you continue. Eventually, you switch to his right ear. Nick smiles with his eyes closed and tilting his head now to the right.
I really fuck with furries.
So, we have all these pieces which compose the boundaries Zootopia and Nick occupy, which makes these animals close to human, but not quite. Part of Nick's appeal comes from the fact that he is not a human man, but also positively comes from the fact that he is a fox. At the same time, in the movie, Nick is identifiably racialized, and the construction of race is primarily a human invention. Nick is sexualized, but in a specifically human way, and yet Nick is relegated, both within the film and beyond it, as non-human. This leads back to our central problem of, they made the fox hot, but we're not supposed to think the fox is hot. We are not supposed to have any romantic or sexual attraction to the non-human, which, okay, but that's not the problem. Part of the problem, as we've skirted around for a bit, is that the human is constructed to be above the non-human. That the animal life is less valuable than the human, and the definitions between human and non-human, as argued by the Afro-Pessimists and so many other critical theorists, are flexible and fluid. That, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, in our culture, the decisive political conflict which governs every other conflict is that between the animality and the humanity of man. That is to say, in its origin, Western politics is also biopolitics. In Zootopia, there's a reason political figures need to reclassify predators into savages, monsters, non-mammals before enacting violence onto them. There's a reason why populations are replaced with what scholar Carol Adams calls mass terms. Terms like illegals, heathens, thugs, bums have all relegated communities into a position of lesser than. Like, with bum for an unhoused person, we have this connection with laziness, placidity, personal responsibility, personal failure. The unhoused failed at being people, so why not start to encroach on aid programs and other points of humanity? Why not take away felons' rights to vote? No one cares about them anyway. No one knows their names. There are reasons why, especially in instances of anti-black police violence, we hear and see calls to say their name. Those who benefit from the violence and seek to uphold it will continue to reinstate a victim's inhumanity. He dealt drugs. She was not a citizen. They are not like us. They are vermin. dogs, monsters, etc. 46,000 dead for the safety and security of a country. Drawing lines between human and non-human, savage and civilized, predator and prey. So civil and docile, while blaming the other for the violence they have enacted upon that other. Maybe Zootopia wasn't too far off with their metaphor after all. So how do we fix this? As you're probably well aware, we live in a society which values disposability in our objects as a core idyllic quality. New phones every year, everything in plastic, degrading computers and cars and roads and clothing, which can be easily replaced with equally cheap and garbage alternatives. My first word of advice for resisting the influence of mass terms is to start caring about the shit you live with. Marie Kondo your objects not with the intention of throwing out half of your wares, but recognize the value each object holds within your life. You should be an owner of valuable things, not value in capital, but in meaning. Next, if and only if you have a stable and healthy relationship to food, start thinking more about the animal products you consume. If you want to think about the animals, go for it. But also think about the meat plant workers who are harmed while doing their jobs. When you buy a chicken, understand the value that bird offered in its death, the value the plant worker offered in their preparation of the bird, and make complete and total use of it. Make broth with the scraps and think about what was taken and offered to you in order to eat such a wonderful little soup. Just as your objects connect you with others through their meaning, so too does your meal connect you to the chickens and the people who raised them, slaughtered them, and delivered them to you. If reflecting on the chicken's death is too much, understand the value you are gaining from it is unequal to everything given up to place that bird in front of you and buy less chicken. Resist the mass terms in your food. Buy local when you can, and buy less of what you recognize is not worth it. If you have an existential crisis about eating too much beef, eat more beans. Just work to understand how your actions interact and influence the lives of the communities and beings around you. Step 3, although you don't have to do these in any particular order to resist mass terms, is to begin seeing everyone as your equal. See inequality as a trick by the state to begin to employ mass terms. Every single person has their place in our current economic system. Even the unhoused make sure the whole thing keeps running by maintaining unemployment rates and the illusion of scarcity within capitalism. In response, treat everyone as a human being that is worthy of love and respect and consideration, worthy of community and aid. See the individuals, begin to care, and begin to help. Watch the news and come to know the people the government are calling dangerous and vermin and monster as your neighbor. Recognize and know them by name and profession and interests and hobbies. Know them as not other or lesser, but the same as you. Know them as friend, as with all the other objects and animals and beings in your life, as incredibly valuable and necessary. Sadly, Judy Hopps does not do this in Borba's infamous 2017 Zootopia fanfic comic I Will Survive. Taking place after the events of the first Zootopia film, the comic follows a morning in the lives of domestic couple Judy and Nick as Judy finds out she is pregnant. After sharing the news, Nick reacts with excitement as Judy reacts with fear. The mixed breed couple is part predator, and Judy is afraid the fetus will turn out to be, quote, some kind of freak, along with being, quote, a little too big for her. Judy wants safe, legal, and within her rights. Remember 2017? But her rationale does offer concern as to how she views Nick as a partner. Would crossbreeding with a prey animal the same size as Nick offer the same response? What are the underlying assumptions that come with, if I had a baby with my partner, it would be a freak? Especially when we are asked to interact with the world of Zootopia as racial allegory. Like, if we hold the metaphor, Borba has created a storyline where Judy is afraid of having a mixed race child, a fear set in American culture since the inception of race as a colonizing technology. Despite its absurdity, I Will Survive remains grounded with Judy's continual reinstating of Zootopia's domination of the predator subservient to the prey. Cross-species children have no problem up until it becomes a matter of the predator and the prey. Within America as a culture, especially within white hegemonic communities, we like to think of the end of the Civil War as the starting point where Black Americans began the long process of becoming recognized legally and culturally as full and equal people within the white hegemony of the United States after becoming free. At the same time, Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court case which legalized mixed-race marriage, was heard over 100 years after the end of the Civil War. Whiteness held and continues to hold extended privileges and visual dominance in my country, and yet, as America operated within a slave economy, we got legislation and pamphlets which reinstated the fragility of whiteness. As Nyla Provost notes in her work, the fear of racially mixed couples in America was, and I'd argue still is, in response to a fear of breaking the boundaries of whiteness. A famous 1864 propaganda pamphlet argues racial mixing is a plot against the dominance of white America, and these fears in turn became reinstated through one-drop rules. Whiteness becomes something which can be stolen, something which can be lost, something one may not be able to pass on to their children. The dominant group must always be in trouble of losing their dominance. They must always use this fear of loss to justify their dominance, the necessity of the hierarchy. If we rid of the hierarchy, then surely those we subjugated would reinstate it, this time with us possibly on the bottom, likely on the bottom. Thus, the true equality or equity is never possible. The oppressor often struggles imagining a world where those they have harmed do not in turn harm and dominate them, if given a chance. We recognize and interact with bigotry all too often like Zootopia does. Inequality becomes a personal failure that requires personal retribution and personal forgiveness. We trust individuals, not mass terms. It's about seeing every single person as such, recognizing pain no matter where it comes from as such, interrogating and removing the systems and policies which seek to redefine people and pain as something else. Progress, then, all comes down to trust. Trust that you see me, respect me, and I am doing the same. Trust has its limits, sure, but throughout this section I've given you the simplest place to start. Begin to care about good, and recognize, then oppose violence. Do this with others. This is where we can create community and recognize needs and trade our support. It is here, together, where we become human. It is here, together, where we can know it.
Like, I think everyone who's a furry hater is just jealous of the freedom that comes with expressing yourself.
There's a lot of vulnerability in trust. It requires another person knowing they will not cause you harm. If they do, it is knowing they will seek to remedy it. Trust is the offering up of your agency for some better good. I'm not sure it's always rational, but it's important within our relationships, micro and macro. To break trust on purpose, to steal the autonomy and humanity of another on purpose, though, that can be unforgivable. Judy and Nick's relationship is built on trust, sure, but it's not consensual. Judy exists on a hierarchy above Nick in her identity, in her occupation, and through her explicit blackmailing. Throughout their story, we see so many instances where Nick puts his trust into Judy, forcibly or otherwise, and Judy breaks it through her words or threats of violence. Prey in the film read the desire of trust as desire for domination. They again reinstate their fears at every possibility to keep a hold of their power. Judy does this too. She blackmails in hopes of remaining a cop, remaining part of Zootopia's law. The narrative constantly positions her as being responsible for Nick's position in the narrative, no matter what part we're at. But Nick doesn't need Judy. He just needs to be trusted, to be seen. The way the film cleanly presents this trust is through installing Nick as an officer, symbolically allowing him to enter the box of civility while keeping it just as rigid. Nothing needs to change. The current social contract is good enough to sort out any kinks naturally over time. Trust remains a clinical, systemic thing to to be placed onto the dominated. You will not be harmed all that much if you do not harm us. You will be harmed less the more like us you are. There is no longer trust, but a relegated performance. To exist in Zootopia, you must be indistinguishable from the prey. To thrive in America, be indistinguishable from the politicians and oligarchs who manage the most power. But if this dominating, subjugating thing can somehow be trust, there has to be something beyond it. At the end of Sex in Public, the authors describe a kink performance they watched at a local leather bar. A young man in his 20s is forcibly fed food and milk by another man. A dynamic is established between them in which they carefully keep at the threshold of gagging. The bottom struggles to keep taking in more than he really can. The top is careful to give him just enough to stretch his capacities. The crowd is transfixed by the scene of intimacy and display, control and abandon, ferocity and abjection. People are moaning softly with admiration, then whistling, stomping, screaming encouragements. They have pressed forward in a compact and intimate group. Finally, as the top inserts 2, then 3 fingers in the bottom's throat, incessantly offering his own stomach for the repeated climaxes, we realize we have never seen such a display of trust and violation. We are breathless. The authors come to learn the eater is heterosexual. Where did he learn this transgressive act? How did he come into these desires? And how does he keep this trust with his feeder, with his audience? What desires will the audience project onto him so they may better understand themselves? The performance now exists in the world. How does that interact with your spirit? What must first exist for this desire to make sense in turn? Zootopia does not function well as an anti-racist text, but so many people have found great use through their critique. It is a children's movie that was designed as an apolitical cop story for profit, and it made that profit. The most transgressive part by far, the authors made the fox hot. To realize the fox was made by a person designed to be hot exists as a violation. Why have you done this to me? Why have you challenged my sexuality, my identity, my morality? Release the rigidity of your boundaries. See the qualities and humanity which exist beyond what you could not previously recognize. Your capacity for care and empathy and love are greater than you previously thought. You can imagine what is beyond your capacity. Grow to trust those who challenge you to grow in that capacity a little more. Sentient Stratofortress is an author on Archive of Our Own who, quote, enjoys writing about sex, psychological pain, and robots. They've also written a collection of Zootopia fanfiction, which has gained a modest amount of attention given the subject matter. Beyond the exploration of intimacy between animals, Sentient Stratofortress pushes the envelope even further with multiple stories centering assault. Despite non-consent being a notable genre within fanfic spaces, the ways Sentient explores violence is fairly distinct from the eroticism, even when one informs the other. In early work, Torturous Adolescence, a teenage Nick looks for an avenue to explore his sexuality and is assaulted by an older female rabbit using a certain tool. Stratofortress imagines this act of violence as another incident beyond racist bullying, contributing to Nick's slyness and projection of nonchalant confidence. He has told no one of the crime at the end of the story. Less than a week later, Sentient publishes Bound by a Bunny, continuing a trend of taboo explorations into the intimate experimental lives of Nick and Judy. Although in previous pieces like Ball Gag, Nick has played the dominant partner in their scenes, Bound by a Bunny finds Judy within that role. She has Nick tied up, talks through their safety procedures, and removes a gag from Nick so he can better revoke consent if needed. Judy then uses the same tool Nick was assaulted with in Tortured Adolescence until Nick uses their safe word, quote, sobbing, and Judy stops. They shift their sexual roles, finish their activities, and speak about the initial scene. At the end of the story, Judy begins. I went too far, didn't I? Nick nodded before shedding a tear on Judy's chest. Nick laid his head on Judy's chest before sobbing softly. Judy placed her hand on her fox's head, stroking the red fur gently, while pulling the blanket over Nick's nude body. "Don't worry, Nick," she whispered again. "You're safe." Judy could feel Nick grabbing her body gently, pulling him closer towards her and crying into Judy's fur. Judy placed her hand on Nick's butt cheek before moving her hand up and down to calm him down. After Judy stroked the fur on Nick's chest, Nick started to calm down from sobbing to gently breathing. Judy gazed at the peaceful fox, his back rising up and down while he was breathing into her chest fur. Judy planted another kiss on Nick's head before Nick fell asleep. "Dumb fox," Judy whispered to herself while admiring Nick in his sleeping state. The fox drooled onto Judy's breast, making her giggle as she pulled Nick in closer, hugging him tightly. "My dumb fox," said Judy, before closing her eyes again. Trust, violation, reconciliation. The pair here, despite being closer than we could ever imagine in the original text, despite engaging in a scene with different levels of agency, are now equal and reactive to each other. Nick establishes his need not by shutting down and isolating like in the movie or Borva's work, but by pulling himself closer to her, falling asleep. The violation does not break Nick or Judy in this instance. Judy does not run away from her responsibility of addressing the harm she has caused, and we find characters who have grown beyond the constraints of their purpose. Characters who, carrying on the paths their canonical journeys have established, are now allowed to be. Sentient Stratofortress offers a lot of vulnerability within their work. Their invitation to see these characters as they do simultaneously establishes an admission of guilt. In their offering of the taboo, we know they've considered it as well. We know they've considered the canon and found it too constraining, not quite complete. And Sentient has trust. Trust we feel too. Sentient often explores in their erotics what Zootopia perhaps should have focused more on. Do away with the racial allegory. Become fully devoted to the animals and their interactions explicitly as animals, as unique and agent beings. You can still explore bigotry within those dynamics without, trying to shoehorn a weird racial allegory that just fails. I keep on thinking about that play at the beginning. It's just fine. It's for children. In what, despite their other challenging work, I find to be their most shocking piece, Inner Animal, the author puts to page the natural conclusion to an admission of Nick's attractiveness. The summary: Nick Wilde, ex-female reader. This is your chance to be intimate with a fox. What follows is 3 pages of what was promised, Sentient exploring the explicit sensations of fur and teeth on skin, the movement of the bodies along with the internal dance between shame and desire in the second person. Making love with a fox is undoubtedly taboo, but that is what makes it all the more exciting. It's your chance to be debauched, daring, and depraved because Nick is a willing outlet to your inner animal. There is a continuation of the hierarchy within this passage and a few others from the start of the fantasy. The narrator compares her feelings for Nick to less intense old feelings she had with pets, but as the characters encounter furthers, the dominance wanes. The narrator becomes more entrenched in specific sensations. You can't help but to let out another squeal, cuddling Nick tightly, feeling his fur on your exposed skin, and your feet seem to be acting subconsciously as you kick off your jeans. If not a naturalness, then there seems to be a necessity within the exchange. A desire can be met, and it must be met. You become a little bit more animal, Nick becomes a little bit more human. He moves like one, tends to your human needs. At once, his foxness is both invisible and more relevant, tender, and erotic than anything else. And when their exchange ends, their desires met, blossomed into fruition, our characters begin to return to their social positions as separate species. Groaning, you hold Nick tightly against you until your breathing eventually returns to normal. Nick smirks, relaxed and cool. His muzzle meets your lips in a gentle kiss, and you kiss back while continuing to cuddle him. Before today, it had been far too long since you last cuddled with a cute, fluffy animal. His muzzle snuggled you affectionately. Still got tooth marks on there, you comment, poking your boob to draw Nick's attention to the red marks his teeth had left. His face falls. Now he looks like a puppy that's just been told off. Did I go too far? No, not at all. You smile and stroke the fur on his cheeks to reassure him. I like it, actually. You certainly know how to leave a mark on your vixen. Nick smiles again and asks, now how does it feel to be an experienced zoophile? Fucking awesome, you say. Reading Sentient Stratofortress's corpus, despite its difficulty, helped me realize something. Nick is not only hot because he is like a man, he is also desired because he is not a man. He's offered sexuality, and so people will occasionally treat him as sexual. Nick becomes a desirable thing impossible to seek out. As Andrea Long-Chu notes in her own work, the desired thing becomes the desiring itself. Desire for the unspeakable, a longing to speak it, finding the trust required to do so. So put the fox on your cake. The fox is hot because we can see him, and because we can create him, and because we can know him. You can like the fox in a not furry way. You can like the fox in a furry way. The fox is hot because deep down we know that Nick is not that different from us. We are scared of that fact because it means somewhere, we know rationally, we may be evolved, but deep down, we are still animals. We are all beings, and that may be the only thing which remains natural. Thanks for watching.